This is Rav Aharon Cutler number 9. As we now have a great picture of this great man, we can get a greater appreciation of a singular aspect of his personality. That was his amazing shkias, his amazing involvement in learning. We mentioned at the beginning what a tremendous genius he was. He was, Gadol's Gadol. But to see how involved he was in learning his whole life is something very special. Rav Yaakov Kamenetsky, no less, commented that Rav Aharon grows so much, he develops so much, and his learning is getting better all the time, that I can no longer argue with him. That's what Rav Yaakov said once. The Rebbetzin served the whole meal, and kompot is for dessert, a little fruit composite for dessert. And Rashiva Rav Aharon had been talking and learning the whole time during the meal, and he had eaten the meal and had the dessert, and then he said to his wife, gave him the dessert, and he said, well, what about the meal? And he said, no, the Rashiva ate already. So he said, okay, so that's fine. So he said, do you want to eat again? He says, no, if I ate, I ate. But he was totally oblivious to the fact that he had eaten. And this is really a beautiful description with his son. His son was Reb Shner, who became the Rosh Hashiva himself, but this was related by Moshe Hamnik. He said he was learning Second Seder, the afternoon part of the learning in the yeshiva, and he was totally engrossed to kocht. And the Seder ended, and people walked out, and it was time to eat. But Reb Aharon kept going, and Reb Shner came over to him and said, Tati, it's time to go. Father, it's time to go with Darfes, and you have to eat. Reb Shiva said, gave a start, and the motion with his hand, wait, it's 20 minutes. Then Reb Shner came back in 20 minutes, says, Tati, you have to go, and he motions 10 minutes. And then he came back 10 minutes later, and again he gave a start. He was all so engrossed, he was shaking, and he motioned 5 minutes, give me 5 more minutes, already 35 minutes later. And then 5 minutes later, Reb Shner came back and said, Avila, just in a little while, well, just a little longer. And they came back in Avila, and the Yeshiva closes Gemara, it's probably, 38 minutes later, and Reb Shner gently took his hand and led him like a blind man going to the dinner. He was so involved. But not only was he so involved in learning, he was so involved when he was doing other things at the same time. The Rav Ephraim Greenblatt, Zichron Levracha, a student of Moshe Feinstein from Memphis, so he said that one time he was telling Rav Aharon a chabura on the subway, and his own Torah thoughts on the subway. And in the middle of Rav Aharon was listening. In the middle of Rav Aharon mentioned something totally from the side. He says, and now the Rashba is understood. So Rav Ephraim wasn't talking about Rashba, he didn't understand. He said, no, I've been working on a difficult Rashba for 3 days, and I just understood the answer. But he says, don't worry, I heard everything you said. So at the same time Rav Aharon was listening to the Rav Ephraim, he was thinking about the Rashba in the back of his head. He once was in the middle of a klal meeting with Rav Shraga Feivel Mendelovich, who we mentioned previously from Torah Masorah, and he walked out, and he had a whole meeting, but when he walked out of the meeting, he said, B'zem Yushav Kushas Rabbi Akiva Eiger. And now Rabbi Akiva Eiger's question is not difficult. And the Slonim Rebbe says that he was once in a Vadi Yeshivas, another klal activity. And Siva Shalom, who we mentioned before, that Rav Aharon had brought him into Chinuch Atzmai. So they were in a big debate, in the big middle of a discussion, and as you can totally imagine from everything we've been speaking about, when Rav was in the middle of a discussion, he was in the middle of the discussion. His opinion was important. He was a leading opinion in whatever he engaged in, and he saw Rav Aharon suddenly mumbling to himself, and he leaned over to hear what Rav Aharon was saying, and Rav Aharon said, "Sof the Rambam and Tumas Meis is lo maturitz. The Rambam is still difficult." So he had this amazing ability, and it was an ability which even some other Gedolim looked at him and went with total shock how he could be so involved in klal activities and so involved in learning at the same time and keep going through his whole life was absolutely very unusual. And maybe we can't be exactly like him, but we can all be involved more in learning. And we could end with the bracha that Rav Aharon himself said, that he gave a doctor a bracha, you should be zocha to learn between patients. And that's how Rav Aharon was. He was zocha to learn between patients, during patients. He did everything he did, of course, in the greatest way possible, as we've been saying over all the different videos, but yet he had this unique connection to learning his whole life.